In order to fully shape the spar or mast or boom on a sailboat, or for that matter, rounding the corners and turning a square piece of wood into a dowel or into a pole, one needs to be able to mark all the sides and evenly removes material from all four sides, turning a four-sided square into an eight-sided octagon, and then removing those corners until you've almost got it round, and then you can sand it around. And in order to do that, I need to make a marking gauge for a spar. This is just an off-cut piece from the actual spar that I'm making that I've been shaping down. So I'm going to use that as a bit of a sample. All that's needed is a scrap piece of nice piece of hardware. This is just a piece of the rail from the gunnels on the sailing skiff, and well, right now it is sitting at about 10 inches long, which is going to be more than long enough. You'll need either some dowel. I'm going to use some brass rod. You can either use two pencils. In this case, I'm going to use a smaller piece of brass rod to make some points to make the marks. So our objective here is that we are going to mark off the corners with the gauge, and the intention is that with the relationship or ratio in the gauge marking tool is that once done, this space here, distance between these two, will be the same distances between these surfaces that have been flattened off the corners. And by doing so, we end up with, this is certainly not a scale drawing, but the intention is that we will end up with all of these distances here being equal. So the relationship between those is a 7 to 10, 7. I mean, it's a little different than that. It's not exact. But if we take this as a 7, 7, this becomes 10. Now I'm making my marking gauge at about 10 inches long. One could make them as big and as long as you needed, but since I'm not in the business of making large spars, i.e., masts for 60-foot sailboats, this size should be adequate enough. The intention will be is that it'll be run down on a slant like this and make a mark. If you were using and only marking small pieces of square stock like this, you might very well want to just make a small marking gauge, i.e. paddle shafts, small spars, anything that's round. So what I'm going to do is, because it's an easier relationship, is using metric. I've got 24, so if you take 7, 10, and 7, you come up with 24. So I'm going to use 24 centimeters as the distance. So I will need to mark there, 7, and then 10. So we take off 7, 17, 24. I'm going to use my little square here to draw square lines across there. And I'll just use my finger as a guide to draw a line down the center. Now, the important thing is that the larger dowel will be used on both ends, and the smaller dowel will go through the center of these holes and become well, I'll sharpen it up to a point so that it marks. The important thing, though, is that it is the outside or the inside edge of this rod has to be on that line there. We're not going to be drilling through the center of it. I need to drill through the outer edges of it so that the guide will be running along this inside edge. My brass stock is 1/4 and 3/16, so those are the size of holes that I will be drilling into my gauge on my drill press. For the holes that are actually going to do the marking, let's remember to drill right on the center of the hole. So for the pins that are going to do the marking, like it should be a pretty tight fit through there. I don't want them moving, although I will probably add a little bit of glue to that. What I need to make sure is that, it's long enough that I can put a point onto there. So let's say I need that to be 1.25 inches. I'm going to cut 2 pieces of this brass rod at 1.25 inches. For the end ones, which will slide along the stock itself, I would want them to be at least 3/4 inch longer. So we'll go 2 inches on the heavier stock. So 1.25, 2 inches. Now I got a bit of a burr on there, so I'm just going to clean up the edges so that I can drive it through the holes without busting wood. On the other end of the 3/16 brass rod, I'm going to grind this down to a fine point like a nail head. Now I'm just going to drive in my 2 pins on the end here, just flush with the back side. Flush in there. And then I will drive these pins through from this side. Now they're a bit loose, so I will likely put a little bit of a glue in there. Should be able to push those out. I don't want them sliding out. In other words, when I start to push down on it, because I want to push pretty hard, I cannot have these pins coming out. I think what I'll do is I'll make a few score marks on here on the sander so that the glue will kind of fill gaps. I was thinking of using a CA glue, but I just didn't think that was going to be thick enough and strong enough, so I'm going to use just a little dab of 5-minute epoxy, West System G5. Thicken it up a little bit more, we'll add a little wood flour. And that should be enough glue. So now I'm going to be pushing them through from this back side. So let's just put a little glue in the hole. Just going to push it into there. Now I want to make sure these are all flush onto the surface. And I'll just clean off any of the squeeze out glue here. Let that sit a few minutes and we're ready to try marking our sample spar. I've got my marking gauge, glue is set up enough. I don't think those are going to move out of there, hopefully not. If they do, we'll have a little more. So the idea is that you're going to run these 2 guides along the outer edge, turning it. If it was a wider piece, it wouldn't be turned very much. If it's a narrower piece such as this, still works, would be a little more difficult. But those gauges will still run down there, and they're always going to be marking at that ratio of 7-10-7. So let's give it a try. So I'm just making a mark, and then we can mark it up with a pencil where my marks are. Now, it does tend to be riding a little bit into the grain of the wood. I'm just wondering whether or not these pins might be better set in a bit deeper so that it's closer to the wood, but it's still marking correctly. So what needs to happen is we got to do all 4 sides. Whoop, that's where it happens. It's all sliding off the end. I did make these 2 spar marking gauges. Now on the larger one I did find that the pins were actually being pushed through as I was pushing down, so I glued on a bit of a backing plate here so those 2 pins can't go through. But my preferred one is the smaller one here that I actually use with pencils. As much as the pencils kind of move and you really have to jam them in there, what I find with the metal pins, when I'm sliding that down the spar, especially on a softwood like fir or spruce, the pins kind of tend to follow the grain of the wood, so even though you're pressing as hard as you can. The other thing is that if I'm digging too deep with the metal pins, then you actually have to sand those out because I can make quite a dent into the softwood. So I do prefer the smaller one with the pencils, which is what you'll see me using mostly on the spar.